Well, today I'll be talking about 10 underrated rock albums from my collection. And I did do a video on 10 underrated metal albums from my collection. If you haven't seen that video, make sure to check it out after this video right here. Yeah, these 10 albums will be in no particular order, but the first album I do want to talk about is from 311 with their album Evolver from 2003, and this would be their follow-up to their album From Chaos, and that album had one of their big hit singles, Amber, on it. But yeah, this album would come 2 years later, and nowadays really the only song that gets really any attention from this album nowadays is the opening track, Creatures for a While, which I still think is one of the band's best songs, but I feel like the rest of the album kind of gets overlooked a little bit. I think it definitely has its share of fairly underrated songs. To name a few examples, I think some songs that easily come to mind when it comes to this is Crack the Code, definitely one of my favorites on the album. I do really like Beyond the Gray Sky, which is one of the more slower songs on the album, one of the more reggae influenced songs on here. I really like that song a lot. I do like the bass work from Peanut and Don't Dwell, track number 9. I do like the heavy riffs that you get in Other Side of Things, which is one of my personal favorites from the second half of the album. Sometimes Jack Rules the Realm is, to me, probably one of the band's best album closes, I'd say. I don't know if it's one of my personal favorites on the album itself, but I still would say, at least again, one of the band's best album closers. But yeah, pretty good album in my opinion, and yeah, solid 311 album. Next, we're moving to something a bit older with Aerosmith, Done with Mirrors. And this album would see the return of Brad Whitford and Joe Perry, because those two guys were not on the album that came before this one, Rockin' a Hard Place, which I like that album actually. I think it's a tad underrated, but I do think this album is a little bit better. I mean, this album also feels a bit more raw. It was also produced by Ted Templeman, who worked with Van Halen. And yeah, definitely a really overlooked album in their discography. I know some of the band members are not too big on this album, especially Joe Perry, if I remember correctly, but I personally really dig the album. I mean, I wouldn't rank this album as one of the band's best, but I still think it is still pretty solid, pretty good album actually in my opinion. Probably the most well-known song on here is probably Let the Music Do the Talking, which is of course a song that Joe Perry did when he did his solo stuff before this album. And yeah, definitely easily one of the best songs on the album in my opinion. I'd say Sheila is another highlight off the album for me. I really like that song and its overall mood and vibe too. My Fist Your Face, I think, is another one of my favorites too, and this is another album that I think has share fairly underrated songs. One of those songs being The Reason, A Dog, and I'd also mention She's on Fire too. I really like that song. That's another one of my favorites on here, but all around, another really great album from Aerosmith in my opinion. Again, maybe not one of their best, but I still dig it though. But moving on, we'll be moving to The Cult with Ceremony. This would be their follow-up to their commercially big successful album, Sonic Temple. So with this album, it would come out in 1991, a couple years after Sonic Temple. And this album commercially didn't do as well as Sonic Temple, but I personally really dig the album. I think it's a strong entryway into the 90s for them. Or at least a strong start into the 90s for them is what I'm trying to say. But some of my favorites on the album, the title track, for me, one of the band's best album openers. Of course, you have some of the bigger songs on here, Wild Hearted Son and Heart of Soul, both really great songs and some of the best songs on here. But I feel like you do get some of the band's most underrated stuff on here. A big one for me being White. I feel like that's probably one of the band's most underrated songs. I really like that song a lot. If I remember correctly, one of the more longer tracks on the album, but I personally still really dig it. Definitely one of my favorite songs on the album. I would say that I do think the first half is probably stronger than the second half, but I do like the second half though. It definitely has its highlights like Bangkok Rain and Sweet Salvation, but all around, another really good album from The Cult in my opinion. And now we're moving to Filter with The Amalgamut. And this album would follow up their commercially successful album, Title of Record, which of course had one of their big singles, Take a Picture. And this album commercially didn't do as well as Title of Record, but I feel like this album is easily one of the band's best though. The big song on here is probably Where Do We Go From Here. I do think that is one of the band's best songs, but you also have You Walk Away, which I think is a strong way to open up the album. I definitely get the heavy riffs that you get in that song. You also have The Only Way Is the Wrong Way, which is one of the more melodic songs on the album. I really like that one. But I think this album honestly has some really good deep cuts, such as So I Quit, which is one of the more heavier songs on the album. My Long Walk to Hell, I think, is maybe one of my favorite Filter songs. I really like Columbine too, and the heavy nature of that song. It Can Never Be the Same, I feel like, is maybe one of my favorite deep cuts in general from Filter. But yeah, all around pretty great Filter album in my opinion. But now we're moving to an album that is from, in my opinion, one of the most underrated bands out there, King's X, with their self-titled album. This is definitely one of my favorites from the band. I mean, when it comes to King's X, most people talk about Gretchen Goes to Nebraska and Dogman. But I feel like this album is right up there with those two albums as some of the band's best work. This would be their final album to be produced by Sam Taylor, if I remember correctly, but you get some of my favorite King's X songs on here, like Prisoner. Prisoner is probably a top 5 King's X song for me. I absolutely love that song. Maybe my favorite song on here. I mean, of course, the big song on this album is Black Flag, but again, while that is a song that definitely gets its share of attention, I feel like the rest of the album kind of does get overlooked a little bit, and honestly, there's some really good stuff on here. Some really good deep cuts too, especially like Not Just for the Dead and Lost in Germany, but and What I Know About Love. But yeah, really dig this album a lot. Definitely one of my favorite King's X albums. And now we're moving to Living Colour with arguably maybe their heaviest album with Stain, their third album, which would come out in 1993. Their label, or the record company, however you want to put it, pushed the band to go in a more darker direction with this album, and they definitely did. You definitely get some of their darkest material in this album, and they go in a heavier direction. And yeah, honestly, this album and Vivid kind of fight for being my favorite Living Colour album. I really do think this album really is that good. Really dig the heavier side of Living Colour that you get with this album. I mean, some of my favorites on here: Go Away, Ignorance is Bliss, Leave It Alone, I think is one of the band's best singles. I also like Auslander, if I pronounced that correctly. That's definitely one of my favorites on here. Nothingness, which is a ballad and definitely one of the band's best ballads, and maybe one of my favorite Living Colour songs in general. And Wall, I think, is kind of an underrated song, especially when it comes to the second half. The second half is, to me, maybe not as strong as the first half, but I still do dig the second half, though, especially the album closer, Wall. But yeah, definitely a really great Living Colour album, in my opinion. But this would be their final album for a while until they would come back in 2003 with their album Kaleidoscope. Yeah, really good stuff. If you haven't heard it, definitely check it out. But now we're moving to some prog with Pink Floyd, Obscured by Clouds. This is honestly one of my favorite Pink Floyd albums, but some of my favorites on here, Burning Bridges, Childhood's End, and Free 4 maybe being one of my favorite Pink Floyd songs. I also like What's the Deal. But yeah, really dig this album a lot. Honestly, maybe a top 5 Pink Floyd album for me. At least top 5. But now I'll be moving to one of my favorite bands in general with Rush, Power Windows. This is during their synthesizer era, their 80s era. And when it comes to Rush, of course, most people talk about like albums like Moving Pictures, 2112, Hemispheres, and albums like that. Permanent Waves being another one, or even Signals. But this is one of the more, you can maybe say, dark horse albums in their catalog. And of course, they do have a few other ones that you can maybe give that title to, the Dark Horse title. But I really dig this album a lot, actually. I mean, some of my favorites on here, The Big Money, which is maybe one of my favorite singles from the band. I mean, yeah, you do have some synthesizer cheese in this album. You can definitely tell it's of its time, but I still really dig the album a lot. I mean, again, The Big Money, one of my favorites on here. I also dig Marathon, Middletown Dreams, and Mystic Rhythms is another single for them that I think is probably one of my favorite singles from them. But yeah, all around, really good stuff. Definitely, I mean, I don't know if it's one of my favorites from the band, but it would be in the upper half of their catalog for me, again, if I were to rank their albums. But now I'll be moving to some grunge with Stone Temple Pilots with their final album until they would come back in 2010 with the self-titled, with that album being their final album with Scott Weiland. But Shangri-La-Di-Da from 2001. Definitely a pretty underrated album in my opinion. I mean, Days of the Week, from what I've heard, didn't do all that well in terms of reception when it first came out. But I do think there are some other pretty strong songs on the album, though. I really like Coma. I think you move towards the second half or towards the middle of the album where you get some pretty good stuff like Too Cool Queenie and Bipolar Bear. I also like Wonderful. That's a pretty underrated song off the album too. I definitely dig the heaviness of some of the songs on here like Dumb Love and Coma. But you also have your more melodic moments too, like Too Cool Queenie. But yeah, all around, I actually really dig this album. And honestly, at least to me, this is the band's last good album in my opinion. I'm not too big on their self-titled album, the one with Scott Weiland, not the one with Jeff Goot, but I'm not too big on their 2010 album. And then the stuff that they've done with Jeff Goot so far, I haven't been all that impressed with. I wouldn't say it's straight up bad, but not really something that really does much for me. I'm not even too big on that EP they did with Chester Bennington, and I'm a big Linkin Park fan, and I am a big fan of Chester Bennington. Of course, rest in peace, but I'm honestly not too big on the EP that they did with them. Not bad, but not really my thing. Didn't quite do it for me, but Shangri-La-Di-Da, actually pretty solid album in my opinion from Stone Temple Pilots. And now for the final album for this video, we're moving to Third Eye Blind with Out of the Vein. Pretty good stuff. This would be their third album, and this album would also see the introduction of Tony Ferdinelli, if I got the last name right, or if I pronounced that correctly, but this would be their last album for a little bit until they would come back in 2009 with Ursa Major, which I think is another solid album for them. But yeah, I think this album is easily one of the band's best. You have some of my favorite songs from Third Eye Blind on here, like Blinded and Crystal Baller. I also like Can't Get Away. You also get some pretty good deep cuts on this album, like Danger, and I also like Palm Reader. Wake for Young Souls is also pretty good. Probably one of my favorites when it comes to the second half of the album. But yeah, I'll be actually seeing Third Eye Blind live for the first time on Saturday at Northern Quest, and I'm definitely really looking forward to that. Definitely looking forward to seeing them live. But yeah, all around, pretty good album from Third Eye Blind. I wouldn't say it's their best, but I would say at least one of their best, though. But yeah, those are 10 underrated rock albums from my collection. Let me know your thoughts. Do you agree that these albums are underrated? Or do you like any of these albums? Are you a fan of any of these bands? Let me know if you can think of any more underrated rock albums or any underrated rock albums from your collection and all that good stuff. But anyways, thanks for watching. Please leave a comment and a like, subscribe. Have a nice day, and take care.